I pulled into my own driveway after a long day at work and found a champagne-colored Lexus sitting in my garage, parked at a slight angle like it owned the place, with my garage door wide open to the street for anyone to see. Sharon Bellwether, HOA president, 3 houses down, had let herself in through a garage code she had absolutely no legitimate reason to know, and parked her car inside my garage because, in her words, her own driveway was being repaved, and my garage was just sitting there empty most of the day anyway. I didn't argue. I didn't confront her. I didn't even ask her to move it. I simply closed the garage door, with her car still inside, left for a previously planned 2-week business trip the very next morning, and let Sharon Bellwether spend 14 days discovering exactly what happens when you assume someone else's property is yours to use. My name is Curtis Yamada. I'm 39 years old, and I live in a development called Pinehurst Crossing outside Denver, Colorado. I work as a regional sales director for a medical equipment company, a role that involves fairly frequent travel, typically 6 to 8 multi-day business trips per year, on top of my normal workday schedule, which usually has me leaving the house by 7:30 in the morning and not returning until well into the evening. My garage is a standard 2-car attached garage, and like most modern garage door systems, it operates through a numeric keypad mounted on the exterior wall beside the door, in addition to the standard remote control I keep in my car. This keypad system requires a programmed access code to operate, which I had set, when I first moved into the house about 5 years ago, to a code I considered reasonably memorable, but not something I'd shared with anyone beyond my immediate family. I want to walk through how Sharon Bellwether came to know this code, because the answer to that question turned out to be considerably more significant to this story than I initially realized when I first discovered her car parked inside my garage. Pinehurst Crossing is a development of about 170 homes, with a fairly standard HOA structure handling typical community matters, landscaping standards, basic architectural review, a small community park area. Sharon Bellwether has lived in the development for about 7 years, 3 houses down from mine on the same street, and has served as HOA president for the past 2.5 years. I want to be fair in describing my relationship with Sharon prior to this specific incident, because I think the full context matters. We had a generally cordial, if not especially close, neighborly relationship for most of the time I'd lived in Pinehurst Crossing, the kind of relationship where we'd wave when passing, occasionally chat briefly at a community event, but otherwise lived fairly separate lives without much direct interaction. About a year before the central incident of this story, I had agreed, as a reasonable accommodation during a specific, limited situation, to let Sharon use my garage code temporarily. The context was this: Sharon's own garage door opener had malfunctioned during a period when she was expecting a significant furniture delivery while she and her husband were going to be out of town for a long weekend, and she'd asked, somewhat desperately given the timing, whether the delivery company could be redirected to use my garage as a temporary secure drop-off point, with me then transferring the furniture to her house once she returned. This was, I felt at the time, a genuinely reasonable neighborly favor to extend, and I'd provided Sharon with my garage code specifically for this one-time purpose, fully expecting that the code would simply be used for that single delivery coordination and then forgotten, since I had no ongoing reason to think she'd need or use it again. What I did not do, and what I now recognize as a meaningful oversight on my part, was actually change my garage code after this temporary arrangement concluded. I want to be honest that this wasn't any kind of deliberate ongoing trust extended to Sharon specifically. It was simply something that slipped my mind once the immediate situation had resolved, the kind of small administrative follow-up task that's easy to forget about once its original purpose has passed. This oversight, as it turned out, created exactly the opening that led to everything else in this story. About 2 months before the central incident, I came home from work on an ordinary Tuesday and noticed, walking into my garage, that a few items on my garage shelving, some tools, a couple of storage bins, appeared to have been shifted slightly from how I normally kept them organized. Nothing was missing, nothing was damaged, but the arrangement was subtly different enough that I noticed it, being someone who tends to keep a fairly consistent organizational system in my own spaces. I didn't think much of this initially, attributing it to perhaps my own forgetfulness about exactly how I'd left things, or possibly some maintenance work I'd forgotten I'd scheduled. But over the following weeks, I noticed this pattern repeat itself on a few additional occasions, small, subtle shifts in how my garage space appeared, never anything dramatic or clearly identifiable as a problem, but enough to create a nagging, low-level sense that something was happening in my garage during the hours I was away at work. I want to be honest that I didn't immediately suspect Sharon specifically during this period. My suspicions, to the extent I had any clear ones, were vague and unfocused, wondering if perhaps a maintenance worker from some HOA-related service call had used my garage as informal staging space or some similarly innocent explanation. I installed a simple garage interior camera, primarily just to satisfy my own curiosity and put my mind at ease, expecting that I'd likely find nothing notable and could stop wondering about it. What the camera actually revealed, within its first full week of operation, was considerably more direct and unambiguous than I'd anticipated. What the camera showed. The camera footage, reviewed over the following 2 weeks, showed a clear and recurring pattern. On 4 separate weekday occasions during this initial monitoring period, Sharon Bellwether's vehicle entered my garage during mid-morning hours, remained parked there for several hours, and then departed sometime in the mid to late afternoon, all occurring during periods when I was reliably at work and would have had no direct knowledge of what was happening at my own house. I want to describe what I observed in this footage with as much precision as I can, because the casual, unhurried manner in which Sharon used my garage space struck me as genuinely remarkable once I actually had clear visual confirmation of what had been happening. She would pull in, park in roughly the same spot each time, occasionally retrieve something from her car's trunk that looked like grocery bags or packages, and on at least 2 occasions, spend several minutes in the garage itself, appearing to use the space as something closer to a personal storage or staging area rather than simply parking and immediately leaving. I began to understand, watching this footage, that this had likely been going on for considerably longer than just the past few weeks of camera monitoring, that the subtle shifts in my garage organization I'd noticed over the preceding 2 months had, in fact, been Sharon's recurring use of the space, simply happening with enough subtlety and infrequency that I hadn't caught it through casual observation alone. I want to address directly why I didn't immediately confront Sharon the moment I had this clear camera evidence. Partly, I'll admit, I was simply curious to understand the full scope and pattern of what was happening before addressing it. But more significantly, I found myself genuinely irritated by what felt like a casual, unbothered presumption on Sharon's part, using my private garage space, accessed through a code I'd provided for an entirely different, limited purpose almost a year earlier, without ever once asking me directly whether this ongoing use was acceptable. I decided, somewhat deliberately, to simply continue observing rather than immediately confronting her, partly to understand the situation fully, and partly because I'd already begun thinking, even at this early stage, about how I might want to handle this once I had a complete picture. The day I caught her directly. The incident that finally brought this entire situation into direct, face-to-face confrontation happened on a Thursday evening, about 3 weeks after I'd installed the garage camera. I'd left work slightly earlier than usual that day due to a cancelled late afternoon meeting, and arrived home to find, for the first time experiencing this directly myself, rather than through camera footage, Sharon's champagne-colored Lexus parked inside my open garage. I want to describe this moment specifically because it crystallized, for me, exactly the casual presumption that had apparently been driving this entire pattern. The garage door was wide open, visible to the street, with Sharon's car parked at a slight angle inside, clearly not concerned about being discovered or about how this might appear to anyone passing by. I parked my own car in my driveway, rather than attempting to pull into my garage alongside her vehicle, and walked up to find Sharon herself standing in my garage, apparently in the process of unloading what looked like several bags of mulch from her car's trunk, presumably intending to store them temporarily before transferring them to her own property. I asked her as directly as I could manage, while still maintaining a reasonably calm tone, what exactly was happening. Sharon's response, delivered with what I can only describe as genuine, unbothered casualness, was that her own driveway was currently being repaved as part of a planned home improvement project, that this had left her without convenient access to her own garage for the project's duration, and that since my garage was, in her words, just sitting there empty most of the day anyway, she'd figured it would be fine to use it temporarily while her own driveway project was completed. I asked her, somewhat incredulously, whether she had actually planned to ask my permission for this arrangement at any point, or whether she'd simply proceeded based on her own assessment that it would be fine. Sharon's response to this question is, I think, the single most revealing moment of the entire situation. She said that she'd meant to mention it, but that things had gotten busy with the driveway project's coordination, and that she'd assumed, given our generally friendly neighborly relationship, that I wouldn't really mind, given that the arrangement was, in her characterization, temporary and not really costing me anything significant. My decision. I want to walk through my thinking in this moment, because the decision I made to not directly confront or argue with Sharon about this in any extended way, but instead to simply proceed with a previously planned 2-week business trip the following morning without addressing or resolving the garage situation first, was deliberate and, I'll be honest, calculated in a way I think is worth explaining clearly. I told Sharon, simply and without extended argument, that I needed my garage to be clear and that this arrangement, whatever her reasoning, was not something I'd agreed to or was comfortable continuing. I did not, in this conversation, raise my voice, make any specific threats, or engage in an extended back and forth about her justifications. I stated my position clearly, asked her to remove her car and belongings from my garage, and left it at that. Sharon did, in fact, move her car out of my garage that same evening, along with the mulch bags and a few other items I noticed she'd apparently been storing there, including, notably, a small folding table and a couple of patio chairs that I hadn't previously seen in the camera footage, suggesting her use of the space had expanded somewhat beyond simply parking her car. What I did not do in this conversation was directly address the underlying garage code issue, meaning, specifically, I did not tell Sharon that I intended to change the code, and I did not have an extended conversation about the broader pattern of access I'd documented through my camera footage over the preceding weeks. I had, as it happened, a previously scheduled 2-week business trip beginning the very next morning, a genuinely planned trip, not something I arranged in response to this incident, involving a series of client meetings and a regional sales conference that had been on my calendar for several months. I made a specific, deliberate decision that evening. I would change my garage code, effective immediately, locking out the access I'd inadvertently allowed to continue for the better part of a year. But I would not inform Sharon of this change. I would simply let her discover it on her own, whenever she next attempted to use the code. During the 2 weeks, I would be away and unreachable for any immediate, casual resolution of whatever confusion or frustration that discovery might create for her. CHANG, the code. I changed my garage's access code that same evening, a process that took only a few minutes through the keypad's standard reprogramming function, requiring no special tools or technical expertise beyond what any homeowner can typically manage with a basic garage door opener system. I want to be clear about my reasoning here, because I think it matters to understanding the full picture of what I was and wasn't trying to accomplish. I was not attempting to create some kind of dangerous or genuinely harmful situation for Sharon. I wasn't locking her out of her own home, creating any safety risk, or doing anything that would prevent her from accessing her own property or resources during her driveway repaving project. I was simply, finally, properly closing an access point to my own private property that had only ever been intended as a one-time limited accommodation almost a year earlier, and that Sharon had, without my knowledge or ongoing consent, apparently continued using as a casual, recurring convenience for an extended period. I left for my 2-week business trip the following morning, traveling first to a regional sales conference, and then continuing on to a series of individual client meetings across several cities, a trip that kept me genuinely busy and largely disconnected from any day-to-day awareness of what might be happening back at my house in Pinehurst Crossing. End of part 1. I want to be honest that I didn't think extensively about Sharon or the garage situation during the first several days of my trip. I was genuinely occupied with work obligations, and the entire incident, while still mildly irritating in retrospect, didn't feel like something requiring my ongoing attention while I was away. This changed on the 5th day of my trip, when I received a text message from a mutual neighbor, a woman named Priscilla Hartwell who lived across the street from me and who I'd come to know reasonably well over the years, asking, in a tone that struck me as carefully neutral but clearly curious, whether I was aware of some kind of situation involving Sharon and my garage. I asked Priscilla what she meant. What she described, over the following exchange of messages, was the first indication I had that whatever had unfolded in my absence had become considerably more visible and consequential within the broader Pinehurst Crossing community than I'd anticipated when I made my original decision to simply leave without resolving things directly with Sharon. Priscilla told me that Sharon had been seen, on at least 2 separate occasions over the preceding several days, standing at my garage's keypad, attempting various code combinations, apparently growing increasingly frustrated when none of them worked. She also mentioned that Sharon's driveway repaving project had, due to some scheduling complications with the contractor, ended up taking considerably longer than originally planned, meaning Sharon's own garage access remained genuinely limited for a longer period than she'd apparently anticipated when she'd originally decided to rely on my garage as a temporary alternative. I asked Priscilla if she knew anything more about what Sharon had actually been doing to manage her situation, genuinely curious at this point about how the next several days of my trip might unfold given this new information. What Priscilla told me next made clear that this situation had evolved into something considerably more involved than I'd anticipated when I'd made my original, fairly simple decision to just change the code and leave. Part 2. What had actually been happening? Over the remaining 9 days of my trip, I received periodic updates from Priscilla, who, I should note, wasn't deliberately monitoring the situation on my behalf, but simply happened to observe various developments from her own house across the street and mentioned them to me, given that the whole situation had apparently become something of a quiet topic of neighborhood curiosity. What emerged, piecing together Priscilla's observations, along with what I eventually learned directly from Sharon once I returned, was that my decision to change the garage code, combined with the unexpectedly extended timeline of her own driveway repaving project, had created genuinely significant complications for Sharon over those 2 weeks, complications that, I want to be clear, were never dangerous or severe in any genuine safety sense, but that created real, ongoing inconvenience and apparently mounting frustration as the situation continued. Sharon's own garage, it turned out, had become essentially inaccessible for the full duration of her driveway project, not because the garage door itself was blocked, but because the specific layout of her driveway repaving work had made vehicle access to her garage entrance genuinely impractical for the project's duration, a detail I hadn't fully understood during our brief conversation that Thursday evening. Since Sharon's explanation at the time had been relatively vague about the specific nature of her access limitation. With my garage no longer available and her own garage access genuinely restricted, Sharon found herself needing to park her vehicle on the street for the remainder of the repaving project, not itself a catastrophic problem, but one that, combined with some additional complications, created a more significant ongoing inconvenience than either of us had initially anticipated. The additional COMPLICATONS. What made this situation more consequential than simple street parking inconvenience, based on what I eventually pieced together, involved a few additional factors that compounded over the 2 weeks of my absence. First, Pinehurst Crossings HOA, which Sharon herself led as president, had a specific covenant provision, one that, I later learned with a certain ironic appreciation, Sharon herself had actually championed and helped strengthen during her own presidency, restricting extended street parking for any vehicle beyond a 48-hour period. Specifically intended to maintain the community's aesthetic standards and prevent the kind of long-term street parking that some residents had apparently found objectionable in years past. This meant that Sharon, parking her own vehicle on the street for an extended period due to her combined driveway and garage access limitations, found herself in technical violation of her own HOA's parking covenant, a covenant that, under the HOA's standard enforcement procedures, would normally result in a formal violation notice and potential fine if reported or noticed during routine community monitoring. I want to note, with what I'll admit is a certain quiet appreciation for how this particular detail unfolded, that this violation was actually noticed and formally reported through the HOA's own standard community monitoring process. Not by me, since I was out of town and not involved in any way, but by another board member who, performing routine community walkthrough duties that Sharon herself had established as part of the HOA's enforcement protocol, documented Sharon's own vehicle's extended street parking and processed the violation through the HOA's standard procedure, entirely unaware of the personal garage situation that had created the circumstance in the first place. Second, and this detail emerged somewhat later in my understanding of the full situation, Sharon had apparently been relying on convenient garage access, both her own normally and mine during the period she'd been using it, for managing a fairly significant home project of her own. A substantial amount of furniture and home goods she'd ordered for a planned guest room renovation, items that had been accumulating in her garage space over recent weeks, and that she'd apparently been planning to organize and move into her house gradually, a process that became considerably more complicated once both her own garage access and her temporary use of mine was simultaneously unavailable. Sharon's attempts to resolve things. I learned, both through Priscilla's observations and later directly from Sharon, that she had made a few different attempts to address her situation during the period I was away, none of which, as it turned out, proved particularly effective. She had, according to Priscilla, knocked on my front door on at least 2 occasions during the first week of my absence, apparently hoping to either find me home despite my trip or perhaps to leave some kind of note or message, though I never found any such note upon my return, suggesting she'd ultimately decided against leaving anything in writing. She had also, I later learned, attempted to reach me by phone on one occasion, a call I genuinely missed entirely given how busy my actual work schedule was during the trip, and to which I never received any voicemail message, suggesting she'd either decided not to leave one or had simply hung up after the call went unanswered. What Sharon did not do, notably, throughout this entire 2-week period, was reach out to any of my other immediate neighbors to ask whether they had any alternative suggestion for temporary garage or parking access, despite Pinehurst Crossing being a community where, by most accounts, neighbors were generally willing to extend exactly this kind of reasonable, temporary accommodation if directly and properly asked, the same kind of accommodation I had, in fact, originally extended to her almost a year earlier for her furniture delivery situation. My return. I returned home from my business trip on a Friday evening, arriving to find my own garage exactly as I'd left it, empty, properly secured, with the new code functioning exactly as intended, no further unauthorized access having occurred since my initial change 2 weeks earlier. I want to describe my reaction to learning the full scope of what had unfolded during my absence. Once I'd had a chance to properly catch up with Priscilla and piece together the complete picture. I'll admit to a certain measure of genuine surprise at how significantly the situation had compounded. I had anticipated, when I made my original decision to simply change the code and leave, that Sharon would likely experience some moderate inconvenience and frustration, perhaps needing to find some alternative parking or storage solution for a period. I had not specifically anticipated the HOA parking violation, given that this particular complication arose from Sharon's own organization's policy intersecting with her personal circumstances in a way I had no role in creating or anticipating. I received a message from Sharon the Saturday after my return asking if we could talk. I agreed to a brief conversation, which took place on my front porch later that same afternoon. The conversation. Sharon's tone in this conversation was notably different from our exchange that Thursday evening before my trip, considerably more measured, and I'll note, containing what struck me as a genuine, if somewhat reluctant, acknowledgement of how her own assumptions had created the broader situation she'd ultimately found herself navigating. She told me she understood why I'd changed the code, acknowledged that she should have asked me directly rather than simply continuing to use the access from our earlier limited arrangement, and explained, with what seemed like genuine frustration directed at least partly at her own situation rather than entirely at me, the various complications that had compounded during my absence. The HOA parking violation specifically, which she described with a kind of wry, embarrassed acknowledgement of the irony involved, given her own role in establishing and enforcing that very policy. I told Sharon, honestly, that I hadn't anticipated the specific complications she'd experienced, and that my decision to simply change the code and leave without extensive discussion had been driven primarily by frustration at discovering an extended pattern of unauthorized garage use that had apparently been continuing, without my knowledge or ongoing consent, for the better part of a year since our original limited arrangement. We had, over the course of this conversation, what I'd characterize as a genuinely productive, clarifying discussion, Sharon acknowledging clearly that the original limited permission I'd extended for her furniture delivery situation had never been intended as an ongoing, unlimited access arrangement, and that her continued use of the code without checking with me had been a genuine overstep on her part, regardless of how casually she may have initially rationalized it to herself. The HOA parking violation resolution. I want to address what happened with Sharon's HOA parking violation specifically, since it became, in its own way, a small but meaningful coda to the broader situation. Sharon, given her position as HOA president, found herself in the somewhat awkward position of needing to formally respond to a violation notice processed through her own organization's standard procedures, a situation she handled, by all accounts, I gathered through general community conversation, with reasonable grace. Paying the standard fine associated with the violation rather than attempting to use her board position to have the matter dismissed or overlooked, which I think reflected reasonably well on her overall character, even accounting for the broader frustration the entire situation had clearly caused her. I learned through a few other Pinehurst Crossing residents over the following weeks that this incident had become something of a quiet, good-natured point of community amusement, not malicious gossip exactly, but the kind of story that circulates informally in a close residential community, particularly given the specific irony of the HOA president inadvertently violating her own community's parking standards due to a self-created garage access situation. Where things stand now. I want to describe how my relationship with Sharon has evolved in the time since this situation fully resolved, since I think it reflects a genuinely reasonable, if not especially close, ongoing neighborly dynamic that emerged from what could have become a considerably more contentious, drawn-out conflict. We have not had any further incidents involving garage access, parking, or any other significant point of friction since this situation concluded. Our interactions have returned to roughly the same generally cordial, if not especially close, pattern that characterized our relationship before any of this began. Waves when passing, brief pleasant exchanges at community events. Nothing more elaborate than that, but also nothing approaching the kind of ongoing tension or hostility that might have developed had I handled the original confrontation differently. I did not pursue any further formal action beyond simply changing my code and allowing the natural consequences of Sharon's own situation to play out during my absence. No police report, no HOA complaint of my own, no civil claim of any kind. I want to be honest that part of this restraint reflected a genuine assessment that the situation, while certainly an overstep on Sharon's part, didn't rise to a level warranting more formal escalation, particularly once she directly acknowledged the issue and the natural consequences of her own circumstances had already created a meaningful, if unintentional, accountability moment. What I learned. I've thought in the time since this situation concluded about what it actually illustrates, beyond its specific and somewhat unusual circumstances involving a garage code, a driveway repaving project, and an ironic parking violation. The core lesson, I think, centers on the value of allowing natural consequences to unfold rather than always defaulting to direct, immediate confrontation when addressing a boundary violation. I could have had an extended, heated argument with Sharon that Thursday evening, demanding immediate explanations and assurances. I could have escalated immediately to a formal complaint or some other dramatic response. Instead, I made a relatively simple, low-drama decision: close the access point that should never have remained open as long as it did, and allow whatever consequences followed from that straightforward action to play out naturally without my active management or escalation. What followed wasn't something I orchestrated or anticipated in its specific details. I had no way of knowing about the extended driveway repaving timeline or the HOA parking covenant, or how these various factors would compound during my absence. But the underlying principle, I think, held true regardless of the specific details: removing unauthorized access to something that's genuinely yours, and then simply allowing the natural, foreseeable consequences of someone else's own choices and circumstances to unfold, often produces a more genuine, lasting resolution than an extended confrontation ever could. My garage remains exactly what it's always been: my own private space, accessed only through a code known only to myself and my immediate family, exactly as it should have been from the beginning. The 2 weeks I spent traveling for entirely unrelated work obligations turned out to resolve a months-long pattern of boundary overstep more thoroughly and more naturally than any argument I might have had on my own front porch ever could have.